Hello, fellow night owl. Before we begin our journey back in time, I want to take a moment to greet you wherever and whenever you may be. Whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening where you are, I am glad you've chosen to join us here for tonight's gentle travel through the eras of our ancestors. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It is always fascinating to see the diverse range of places and time zones represented by this wonderful community of history enthusiasts and curious minds. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, immersive storytelling that blends education and relaxation, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future adventures through the annals of history. But for now, get nice and comfortable, settle in, and let me gently transport you back to a very different time and place. Tonight, we'll be exploring what life was like for women in medieval Europe, a period spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century AD. It was an era of knights and castles, plagues and crusades, soaring cathedrals and sprawling manors. A time of great change and upheaval, but also of entrenched traditions and social hierarchies. For the vast majority of women, daily life in the Middle Ages was a far cry from the romanticized images of chivalry, courtly love, and fairy tale princesses that tend to dominate our modern perceptions. The reality was often harsh, oppressive, and unforgiving, with few rights or freedoms afforded to women. From birth until death, most were subordinate to men. First, their fathers, then their husbands, with little opportunity to determine their own fates. Of course, experiences varied somewhat depending on social class and circumstances. A wealthy noblewoman and a poor peasant girl undoubtedly led very different lives. But across the spectrum, women faced many of the same fundamental challenges and limitations deeply rooted in the prevailing cultural beliefs and practices of the time. In the hours ahead, we'll do a deep dive into many facets of medieval womanhood, tracing the typical trajectory from childhood through adolescence, marriage, and motherhood into old age. We'll explore their daily routines and responsibilities, their role within the family and society at large, the health issues and hardships they faced, and the strict moral codes that govern their behavior. Along the way, I'll share the intimate stories of several real medieval women whose lives left a mark on the historical record. For better or worse, queens and commoners, nuns and noble women healers, and accused heretics, each one with a unique perspective to add to our understanding of this multifaceted era. But before we fully immerse ourselves in the distant past, let's start by setting the scene. Imagine, if you will, a world lit only by fire, a world where the rhythm of life revolves around the rising and setting of the sun, a world of extremes of opulent grandeur for a privileged few, and grinding poverty for the downtrodden masses. Picture a landscape dotted with imposing stone castles, their towers and battlements looming over the countryside. Nearby, thatched-roofed cottages clustered around the manor house, smoke curling from their chimneys. In the distance, the spires of a grand cathedral pierced the sky, bells tolling to mark the canonical hours. The air would have been filled with the earthy scents of wood smoke, baking bread, and farm animals. The soundtrack, a cacophony of barking dogs, braying livestock, ringing hammers and axes from the blacksmith and woodcutter. People toiled ceaselessly from sunup to sundown with little respite from the daily struggle for survival into this world. A medieval girl was born. From her first breath, the odds were stacked against her in a way that is difficult for us to fully wrap our minds around. Today, in our modern world of advanced healthcare, technology, human rights, and equality, it's sobering to confront just how brutally different life was for our foremothers. So, as we step back in time tonight to walk a mile in their shoes, it's important to acknowledge our own 21st century perspective and prejudices. We cannot view the medieval world through a purely modern lens, nor judge its inhabitants by our own standards and values. Our aim is simply to better understand the context and conditions these women inhabit, to listen to their stories with an open mind, and in doing so heighten our awareness of both how far we've come and how far we still have to go in terms of gender equality. So, without further ado, let us begin at the beginning with a glimpse into the tenuous early years of a medieval womaness life. In the Middle Ages, childhood was a precarious and fleeting stage of life, perhaps even more so for girls than for boys. Infant mortality rates were heartbreakingly high by modern standards, with many estimates suggesting that 30 to 50% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Accidents, malnutrition, and disease claimed countless young lives, and the specter of an early grave hovered over every cradle, even for those fortunate enough to survive infancy. The concept of childhood as we know it today, a carefree time of play, learning, and discovery, scarcely existed for the vast majority. Children were viewed as miniature adults with little special regard for their developmental needs and vulnerabilities. As soon as they were old enough to walk and talk, kids were expected to contribute to the family economy in whatever way they could manage, often assisting their parents with daily chores and labor. Childhood was essentially an apprenticeship for adulthood, a time to learn critical skills and prepare to take on mature roles and responsibilities. For girls, this meant focusing almost exclusively on domestic matters with little opportunity for formal education. Unlike some of their male peers who might attend a parish school or receive tutoring from a learned cleric, most girls' schooling took place strictly within the home from a very young age. Girls were indoctrinated into their prescribed place in society. Modesty, obedience, and submission were the chief virtues instilled in them, along with practical homemaking abilities like cooking, sewing, spinning wool, and tending to children and the sick, under the tutelage of their mothers, grandmothers, and older sisters. Girls learned by observation and imitation, absorbing the habits and mores that would shape the rest of their lives. Biblical stories and religious instruction also played a key role in a young girl's moral upbringing, cementing her subservient position in the God-ordained hierarchy of the sexes. While some noble women might be taught to read and write, this was the exception rather than the rule. For the average peasant girl, formal learning was vanishingly rare, and female literacy rates were extremely low, hovering around 5% even among the upper classes. The education of girls was simply not seen as a priority compared to ensuring they were prepared for their ultimate destiny, becoming wives and mothers. And indeed, the end of childhood often came abruptly and decisively with the onset of puberty and marriage. In the Middle Ages, marriage was less about love or personal fulfillment than it was a pragmatic arrangement designed to strengthen family alliances, increase economic stability, and produce the next generation. For girls, marriages were typically arranged by their father or another male relative with little input from the bride herself. Legally, the minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though betrothals and negotiations might begin much earlier. In practice, however, most women married in their late teens to early 20s, especially among the peasantry, where girls were vital sources of domestic labor for their birth families. Still, it wasn't entirely uncommon for very young girls, particularly in noble and royal circles, to be married off to much older men for political or financial gain. We can only imagine the terror and trepidation of a sheltered adolescent girl, barely past the threshold of puberty, faced with the prospect of leaving her family to join a stranger's household. One poignant example of such a child bride was Isabeau of Bavaria, who, at age 15, was wed to King Charles VI of France, a man 16 years her senior, a renowned beauty plucked from the minor nobility. Isabeau was a pawn in a political alliance between France and Bavaria, her personal feelings ultimately of little consequence. Thrown into the strange and glittering world of the French court, the young queen was woefully unprepared for the weighty responsibilities that awaited her. Chief among these was the pressure to produce a male heir to secure the royal line, a duty that would utterly consume the next chapter of her life as a wife and mother. From our modern vantage point, it is difficult to overstate the physical and emotional toll that the transition from maidenhood to marriage would have taken on these young medieval brides, torn from the only life they had known and thrust into an often overwhelming new role. Many must have felt profoundly isolated and unmoored. Wedding ceremonies themselves were less elaborate affairs than we might picture today, with little of the white lace and pageantry that would come to characterize nuptials in later centuries. For common folk, a simple exchange of vows before witnesses, perhaps presided over by a priest, would suffice to seal the contract. Only the nobility could afford more lavish celebrations, and even then, the focus was more on sealing alliances and celebrating the families joining together than on the individual couple. The bride was essentially handed from one man's authority to another's, her own identity subsumed into that of her new husband. In some cases, marriage also marked a definitive break between a woman and her birth family. While poor peasant brides usually stayed close to their parents, it was customary for a new wife to leave her childhood home and move into the household of her husband and in-laws. There, she would be expected to quickly adapt to an unfamiliar domestic hierarchy, learning to navigate relations with her husband's kin, while establishing her own place in the pecking order. Integrating smoothly into this new family unit could be a real challenge, especially for young brides still learning to manage a household on their own. But of all the weighty responsibilities that a young wife shouldered, none was more consequential or potentially perilous than the expectation that she would bear children early and often. In an era of limited medical knowledge and high mortality rates, pregnancy and childbirth were risky endeavors that claimed many promising lives. Join me next time as we explore the joys and sorrows of medieval motherhood, the pressure to produce heirs, the scorn faced by those who bore only daughters, and the heart-wrenching losses endured by women of all stations. We'll get to know one of the era's most fascinating maternal figures in Eleanor of Castile, and trace her turbulent reproductive history across decades of queenship. Until then, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on the little girls of the Middle Ages, the would-be brides and mothers whose childhoods ended almost before they began. Try to imagine yourself in their embroidered slippers, facing an uncertain future in an unforgiving world. Sleep well, and know that when next we meet, we will once more shine a light into history as hidden corners, and give voice to the often voiceless women who lived there. For theirs is a story that deserves to be told, no matter how distant or difficult it may be. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with me. Sweet dreams. And I'll see you soon for another boring bedtime story plucked from the pages of our collective past. Until then, farewell. As we've seen, medieval women were subject to intense oppression and restriction in virtually every area of life. From birth to death, their existences were tightly controlled by the men around them, fathers, husbands, brothers, priests. A woman had little autonomy over her own body, mind, or destiny. She was always under the watchful eye of male authority figures, quick to punish any perceived transgressions. The harsh morality of the Middle Ages, rooted in religious doctrine, placed women in an impossible bind. On one hand, church teachings cast women as inherently sinful and morally weak, daughters of temptress Eve. Their beauty was seen as a threat, a tool for leading men astray. Women were expected to cover their hair and dress modestly to avoid inflaming male lust. At the same time, as wives and mothers, women's primary duty was to be obedient, chaste, and pure. Any hint of flirtatiousness or sexual impropriety could ruin a woman's reputation. Adultery, even if committed by a husband, was always seen as the wife's failure. A jealous or disgruntled husband could easily accuse his wife of infidelity, condemning her to punishment, and those punishments for accused adulteresses were brutal and humiliating. A woman might be paraded through the streets, stripped to the waist, while the town crier announced her sins. She could be whipped, dunked in water, or locked in the stocks while crowds jeered and threw rotten food. In extreme cases, the penalty was death. But a woman need not even commit a crime to be subjected to public mortification. Gossiping, scolding, and nagging were also causes for painful embarrassment, like the scold's bridle. This iron muzzle enclosed the head with a metal bit pressing down the tongue. The accused woman would be led through town to endure mockery and shame. Even for those rare women who sought a religious vocation, freedom remained elusive. Nuns lived ascetic lives with their days dictated by rigid prayer schedules, and their bodies concealed under shapeless habits. Silence was golden. A nun was to be seen and not heard. A few women went to even further extremes, voluntarily imprisoning themselves for life as anchoresses. These religious women were quite literally walled into small cells attached to churches, with only a small window to pass food and receive the sacrament. Most would never emerge again, having freely chosen this grim fate. One of the most famous anchoresses was the English mystic Julian of Norwich. As a young woman, Julian became gravely ill and experienced a series of divine visions. After recovering, she decided to withdraw from the world and live in permanent seclusion. For decades, Julian lived in her cramped anchor hold, spending her days in prayer and meditation. She wrote about her mystical experiences in her book, Revelations of Divine Love, believed to be the first English-language book written by a woman. Julian found spiritual freedom in her confinement, but for most, it was a grim sentence. As Julian scribbled away in her cell, most medieval women toiled in back-breaking drudgery. Their daily reality was nothing short of a waking nightmare by modern standards. Domestic violence was a fact of life, seen as a husband's prerogative to correct an erring wife. The story of Margaret of Flanders illustrates just how vulnerable even highborn women could be. Margaret was the daughter of King Louis IX and was expected to make a glittering dynastic marriage. Instead, she was abducted several times by her husband, the cruel Devo, who kept her in prison for years. Margaret endured unimaginable abuse at his hands, bearing many children. When Margaret finally escaped and fled to her father, her ordeal was far from over. The king sided with his daughter at first, but Devo successfully argued in court that a wife was essentially the property of her husband. Poor Margaret was forced to return to her abuser, who continued to torment her until his death. The tragic plight of this French princess was sadly all too common. Women were essentially chattel belonging to men. Without the protection of family or fortune, common women were utterly disposable. A rural woman might break her back doing farm labor from dawn to dusk, or injure herself hauling water and firewood. Her exhausted body would be expected to produce a brood of children, always hoping for sons. If she managed to survive the dangers of childbirth, she had to contend with near starvation as food was scarce. Malnutrition and repetitive stress would age her prematurely. Disease and poor hygiene ravaged her health. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions. She was old before her time. For unmarried women, survival often meant resorting to begging or prostitution. Unattached females were viewed with deep suspicion by medieval society. Women were expected to be under the dominion of a man, either a husband or male relative. Without that protection and control, they were seen as dangerous and unnatural. Those who sold their bodies to scrape by lived on the margins in every sense. Prostitutes were simultaneously necessary and reviled. Cities like London had designated red light districts, such as Southwark, where brothels could operate under license. But woe betide the woman caught plying her trade outside those boundaries. Severe fines and time in the stocks awaited them. As bad as their situation was, prostitutes still fared better than other desperate women. Those who sank into vagrancy or joined wandering bands of criminals risked brutal treatment at the hands of the law. Medieval justice was swift and merciless. Women could be flogged, branded, or subjected to mutilation for crimes as petty as theft. But all women, whether princess or prostitute, lived in the shadow of an even darker threat. The specter of violence against women loomed large, an inescapable hazard. Men of all classes, from nobles to peasants, saw the women around them as fair game to be used and abused. The notion of consent was virtually non-existent. Only if the victim was an unmarried virgin, ideally of good family, were her claims taken seriously. Even then, the best she could hope for was that her attacker might be pressured into marrying her. After all, he had ruined her, so it was the least he could do to make her his wife. The woman's feelings in the matter were irrelevant. Perhaps nothing illustrates the precarious position of medieval women as much as the fear of witchcraft accusations that hung over their heads like the sword of Damocles. In a world where bad harvest or sickness striking down cattle could threaten a community's very survival, women were convenient scapegoats. Any woman who stood out, whether for her knowledge of herb lore or her failure to conform, could find herself denounced. Midwives and female healers were especially vulnerable, targeted for their dark arts. A woman who eased the pains of childbirth or nursed villages through disease was just as easily painted as a consort of the devil. If crops failed or babies fell ill, she was blamed for wielding evil magic. Witch trials were sham affairs with the outcome decided from the start. Accused women were stripped and searched for the devil's mark, some blemish or mole that supposedly proved their guilt. Confessions were extracted under torture, and not confessing was also seen as proof, so the innocent were damned. Either way, the lucky ones got off with being dunked in water or publicly humiliated. But many accused witches met a fiery end, burned at the stake before a jeering mob. The palpable misogyny at the witch trials served as a potent reminder to all medieval women that they walked a razor's edge. Any misstep or false move could prove fatal. Given this constant suffocating oppression and threat of male violence, it's astounding that medieval women managed to carve out any shreds of agency and self-determination. But in small ways, some remarkable individuals did resist and rebel against the life that men and society prescribed for them. There was Christine de Peasant, one of the first professional female authors, who dared to challenge the rampant woman-hating in male scholarly works. Her book, The Book of the City of Ladies, compiles the stories of notable women and directly confronts misogynistic arguments. As a widow who wrote to support herself and her children, de Peasant faced condescension from male intellectuals, but she persisted nonetheless, arguing passionately for women's moral and intellectual equality. Centuries ahead of her time, de Peasant planted the early seeds of what would eventually blossom into feminism. And in the lives of many ordinary women, there were quiet acts of resilience and solidarity. Women relied on each other for support in the birthing room and formed networks to care for each other as children. In the fields, they shared gossip and complaints, finding fleeting moments of levity and laughter amid the toil. Mothers carefully taught their daughters the skills they would need to survive their lot in life. From managing a household to navigating the treacherous waters of marriage, they armed the next generation with the tools to endure, if not overcome, the hardships that awaited them. Yes, the overall picture of life for medieval women is grim. Their world was one of relentless drudgery, suffering, and submission. And yet, it's crucial to recognize that women were never merely passive victims. They found ways to claim power and agency where they could, in ways big and small. Through it all, they displayed remarkable grit, grace, and resilience. As we close out our journey through the harrowing realities of medieval womanhood, it's worth reflecting on just how far we've come. Today, the notion that women are the property of men to be disposed of as they see fit is abhorrent, and while accusations of witchcraft may still fly in some cultures, we no longer burn women at the stake for crimes they did not commit. But even as we acknowledge this progress, we must remain clear-eyed about the very real injustices and oppressions women continue to face. Worldwide, the forms may have changed, but the fight for true equity and freedom is far from over. Medieval misogyny may seem like a distant relic, but its echoes still reverberate today. So, as you drift off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate the profound strength and courage of the women who came before us. They bore the unbearable, and in so doing, paved the way for future generations to forge a better path. We stand on the shoulders of the medieval women who endured, and we owe it to their memory to keep striving for a world where every woman can live with dignity, safety, and liberty. The road ahead may be long, but as Christine de Peasant so eloquently wrote, the female sex has been left defenseless for so long that some men think it is the way it has to be. Brick by brick, we are proving those men wrong and building a new reality. Medieval women may have lived in a time of darkness, but their unbreakable spirits lit the way forward, candles in the night guiding us on. And that, my friends, is a boring history worth remembering at bedtime. Sweet dreams. The poor hygiene and sanitation of medieval times made life unpleasant for everyone, but women faced extra challenges in managing their monthly cycles. Without the convenience of modern menstrual products, most women relied on homemade cloth pads or rags that were washed and reused. These offered minimal absorption and leak protection. Some women resorted to using grass, hay, sheep's wool, or even moss to stuff into their undergarments during their periods. Needless to say, chafing and infections were common problems. Bathing was a rare luxury for medieval women of lower classes. Even if they had access to a river or stream for washing, the water was often polluted with human and animal waste, spreading diseases. Most people subscribed to the belief that water could carry sickness into the body through the pores of the skin. This led to infrequent bathing, maybe a few times per year, supplemented by sponge baths. Lice and fleas were rampant. Laundry was another constant battle. Clothing had to be washed by hand in a pot over the fire or in a river, scrubbed against a washboard, then wrung out and hung to dry. The process was back-breaking and time-consuming. Wet, heavy clothing placed near the fire was a burn risk. Most families owned only 1 to 2 sets of clothing that were worn threadbare, making the laundering even more difficult. In the castles and manor houses of the nobility, standards of cleanliness were somewhat better, but still fell far short of modern expectations. The wealthy could afford servants to heat water, prepare baths, and launder clothing more regularly. Scented oils and herbs masked odor. However, even the grandest stone fortress lacked running water, flush toilets, and proper waste disposal. Chamber pots were emptied out windows into the courtyards. It is telling that one of the most popular and precious wedding gifts an aristocratic medieval bride could receive was flea fur, a fur wrap meant to attract fleas away from the body. Pests were inescapable. Rats scurrying through bedchambers and banquet halls spread the fleas that carried the bubonic plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, it wiped out an estimated 60% of the population. Women were on the front lines of nursing the sick and mourning the dead. The widespread death and devastation of the plague years disrupted society and accelerated changes in medieval medical practices. Tending to the ill fell largely on women in their roles as wives, mothers, midwives, and nuns. At a time when physicians were expensive and few in number, the care women provided was critical. Convents often served as hospitals of last resort for the poor and destitute. Elderly nuns passed down herbal folk remedies to their novices. Some women parlayed their healing knowledge into careers as midwives, apothecaries, and surgeons. In the 14th century, Paris, Jacqueline Felici d'Almania was put on trial by the medical faculty of the University of Paris for illegally practicing medicine as a woman. Her patients, including priests and noble women, testified on her behalf, praising her diagnostic and treatment skills that surpassed male physicians. Nevertheless, she was excommunicated and barred from practicing further. It was a rare woman who managed to succeed in the male-dominated medical field. More often, a woman's home remedies were labeled as witchcraft and superstition. Anyone deviating from approved church doctrine ran the risk of being branded a heretic or witch. Midwives were especially vulnerable to accusations of sorcery. If a baby or mother died in childbirth, if a woman was knowledgeable about plants and herbs for easing pain or ending pregnancy, she could be condemned for consorting with the devil. The wise woman of a village might be respected as a healer in her youth, but reviled as a witch in her old age. Inquisitors interrogated and tortured suspects, coercing confessions. Once a woman was accused, it was near impossible to prove her innocence, especially if she was unmarried or elderly with no male relatives to defend her. Women comprised over 80% of the estimated 0 to 100,000 unfortunate souls executed for witchcraft between 1500 and 1660. Witch hunts and burnings were the ultimate manifestation of the medieval patriarchy's need to control and punish women who dared defy cultural norms. Even a woman who strove to be a perfect wife, mother, and Christian was still tainted by Eve's original sin, viewed as weak-willed and prone to temptation. To safeguard her virtue, a woman's role was submission and service. Hidden away in the domestic realm of motherhood, venturing out invited male attention and the ruin of her reputation. An unmarried woman was a liability, unable to fulfill her sole purpose of producing children. A married woman was her husband's property, to be protected or punished as he saw fit, regardless of her feelings on the matter. With so much of a woman's worth bound to her fertility, the pressure to bear children was immense. Pregnancy was a state of hope and fear, as the specter of death in childbirth loomed. Noble women were considered successful if they produced at least one male heir who survived infancy. Queens who failed to deliver a prince might be cast aside in favor of a more fertile consort. The chilling fates of Henry VIII's wives come to mind. Peasant women had more reason to dread pregnancy and childbirth without access to the best food, living conditions, and attendance. Malnourishment left many women with rickets, a vitamin D deficiency that deformed their pelvises, making labor even more difficult and dangerous. Birthing a baby often took days, even a week, of sweat, blood, and pain. If labor seemed unending, a midwife might recommend opening the official birthing girdle of the Virgin Mary, kept in the local parish treasury, and placing it on the mother's stomach to speed delivery. This relic was of little practical use. Midwives did their best to ease suffering with herbal tinctures and salves, but could only hope to catch the baby and save the mother from harm. Isabeau's plight was not unique. For girls born into noble families, one's wedding day often came well before one's 18th birthday. Political alliances and strengthening family ties took precedence over a young bride's readiness or personal choice in the matter. Though a privileged queen, Isabeau still faced many of the same challenges as women of lesser means when it came to marriage and motherhood in medieval times. The pressure to produce a male heir weighed heavily. A woman's worth was largely measured by her fertility and the number of surviving sons she bore. Failure to deliver a boy brought shame and scorn. Even for queens, childbirth was a harrowing ordeal, fraught with danger in an age of crude medical knowledge. With each pregnancy, a woman quite literally took her life in her hands. Queen Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, endured a staggering 16 pregnancies over 28 years in the late 13th century. Remarkably, she survived them all, though many of the children sadly did not. Her trials were a testament to the strength and resilience of medieval women in the face of unimaginable adversity. For the great majority who were commoners, not queens, daily life revolved around a relentless string of household chores and back-breaking labor from sunup to sundown. If a woman wasn't cooking, cleaning, sewing, or looking after children, she was likely toiling alongside her husband in the fields, fetching water, or gathering firewood. Privacy was a luxury largely unknown to the average family in the Middle Ages. Most dwellings were small, cramped spaces where everyone ate, slept, and passed their lives in very close quarters. Beds were shared out of necessity, a common enough practice, but one that could certainly breed tension and strife between couples or parents and children. Hygiene and sanitation left much to be desired by modern standards. Fleas, lice, and other pests were facts of life. Chamber pots sat within arm's reach, and waste was often tossed into the streets. It's no wonder that disease ran rampant in medieval towns and cities. But perhaps no aspect of a woman's life was as trying and tragic as the lack of control over her own destiny. The concept of personal freedom and self-determination, as we know it today, simply did not exist for the vast majority of women in the Middle Ages. From cradle to grave, a woman's path was dictated by the men in her life, fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Even a woman of considerable talents and intellect was hard-pressed to forge an independent existence. The French writer Christine de Peasant stands out as a rare exception. After losing her husband at a young age, de Peasant defied convention by supporting herself and her children as a professional scribe and author. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she imagined an allegorical city populated by great women of history and mythology. It was a revolutionary act of the imagination in a time when the prevailing wisdom held that women were weak, fickle creatures incapable of reason or virtue. But de Peasant's proto-feminist thinking was centuries ahead of its time. For most medieval women, their bodies were not fully their own. They were at the mercy of their husbands' desires and whims, subject to physical and sexual abuse with little recourse. Marital rape was not a concept, as a woman was considered her husband's property. Domestic violence was a husband's prerogative. If a beaten wife dared to complain, she was more likely to be chastised for provoking his anger than to see justice served. Even a highborn lady had little protection against an abusive spouse. When Marguerite, the Countess of Flanders, displeased her cruel husband, Louis of Maille, he had her abducted, imprisoned, and threatened with execution in the 14th century. Her story reads like a Gothic nightmare, but it was all too real for countless medieval women. The Church, which permeated every aspect of medieval society, often reinforced oppressive attitudes toward women. Ever since Eve tempted Adam with the forbidden fruit, women had been seen as inherently sinful, morally suspect seductresses who led men astray. Female sexuality was something to be stifled and strictly controlled. A woman's foremost duty was to remain chaste and pure, ideally as a virgin consecrated to Christ, but if not, as a virtuous wife and mother. Woe betide any woman who stepped outside those narrow lines of acceptable behavior. The consequences could be severe: a ruined reputation, abandonment, physical punishment, even death in extreme cases. Some pious women sought to escape the dangers and disappointments of the outside world by retreating into religious seclusion. The English mystic Julian of Norwich chose to be walled into a small cell, attached to a church in the early 15th century, receiving food and necessities through a small window. There she spent decades in solitary prayer and contemplation, even writing a remarkable series of revelations. For her, the anchoress's cell meant safety and spiritual purpose. But to modern eyes, it looks a lot like solitary confinement. As we've seen, life for the medieval woman was defined by constriction of opportunity, of body, of spirit, corseted by rigid gender roles, corseted by religious doctrine, confined to the domestic sphere. She endured tremendous hardship and often died young. But then, as now, women found ways to make their mark, to assert their agency, to fight back against their oppression in ways big and small. Through grit and grace, fury and faith, tears and toil, they persevered. Though the centuries have brought hard-won freedoms and progress, the specter of misogyny that haunted the Middle Ages has not fully released its hold on the present day. In our own time, we are still reckoning with many of the same issues: unequal treatment, the policing of women's bodies, gender-based violence, and discrimination. In learning about the trials faced by our foremothers, we come to appreciate their strength all the more and to see how far we have yet to go. As we remember the women of the distant past, we honor their sacrifices, their indomitable spirit in the face of adversity. We owe it to them to keep striving for a world in which a woman's worth is measured, not by the sons she bears or the home she keeps, but by the force of her intellect, the depth of her compassion, the fire of her conviction, the greatness of her soul. The gloom and chill of a typical medieval peasant dwelling is difficult for us to fathom today, accustomed as we are to modern comforts and conveniences. Imagine, if you will, a 1- or 2-room hovel. Walls erected from wooden stakes interwoven with sticks and packed with a crude mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The floor was simply hard-packed dirt, trodden by the feet of generations. If a family was slightly better off, they might enjoy the relative luxury of a few rough-hewn wooden planks laid across the earthen floor. But there would be little respite from the damp and the cold seeping up from the ground, chilling one to the bone. The thatched roof overhead might keep out the worst of the rain, but it was a constant battle to patch the leaks and keep the vermin at bay. In one corner of this dismal abode, a medieval woman crouched over the hearth, stoking the smoky fire. Soot stained her face and homespun woolen dress. Her red, chapped hands expertly wielded a cast-iron pot, stirring a watery pottage, the mainstay of a peasant family's diet. Into the bubbling liquid went whatever meager vegetables could be spared from the harvest, along with a precious scrap or two of salted pork on a feast day, if they were lucky. This was the domain of the medieval housewife, a dim, suffocating world bounded by the bare earthen walls of the cottage and the muddy trackways of the village beyond. From dawn to dusk, her life revolved around an unceasing round of toil, feeding the fire, hauling water, cooking, spinning, sewing, washing, scrubbing, and tending to the needs of her husband and children. A woman's work was never done, as the old saying goes. And nowhere was this truer than in the Middle Ages, while her husband labored in the fields or perhaps plied a trade as a blacksmith or carpenter in the village. A woman's place was firmly in the home. Her role was to be the subservient caretaker, with little thought given to her own needs, desires, or ambitions. The tools of her trade were simple and few: a couple of cast iron pots, some wooden bowls and utensils, a stone quern for grinding grain into flour, a spindle and a staff for spinning wool into thread. With these meager implements, she was expected to work domestic miracles, stretching scant resources to feed and clothe her family. But even as she stirred the pottage and kneaded the dense black bread, that was the staple of the medieval peasant diet, a woman's mind might drift to higher things. The village priest's Sunday sermon had spoken of the Virgin Mary, that paragon of feminine virtue who had birthed the Savior himself. Surely there must be some greater purpose to a woman's life than this endless drudgery. Such dangerous thoughts were quickly quashed, however, for a medieval woman. The path to salvation lay not in grandiose dreams, but in humble submission to her husband and to God. To strive for anything more was to risk accusations of pride, willfulness, or worst of all, witchcraft. No, far better to keep one's head down, one's virtue intact, and pray for the best in life to come. For in the mortal realm, a woman's lot was one of unrelenting hardship and servitude, and woe betide any woman who dared to step out of line or question her station, as we shall see in the stories to come. One such woman who dared to dream of a different kind of life was Christine de Peasant. Born in Venice in 1364, Christina's father was a renowned physician and astrologer, who secured a position at the court of King Charles V of France when Christine was just a small child. Growing up in the rarefied intellectual atmosphere of the royal court, Christine enjoyed the very best education available to a medieval girl. She learned to read and write in Latin and French, studied classic works of literature and philosophy, and even had access to the king's magnificent library, a repository of knowledge unimaginable to most of her contemporaries. Her father, progressive for his time, believed in cultivating his daughter's mind, and encouraged her scholarly pursuits. At the age of 15, Christine was married off to a nobleman named Etienne du Castel. It was an arranged match, as was typical for the time, but by all accounts, the couple grew to love and respect one another deeply. Christine bore 3 children and settled into the expected role of a dutiful wife and mother. But Christine's domestic tranquility was not to last. In the space of a few short years, she lost her beloved husband to an outbreak of plague, followed by her father's death soon after. At the age of 25, Christine found herself a widow and an orphan, left alone to fend for herself and her young children in a world that had little use for an educated woman without a man's protection. Facing financial ruin and the loss of her cherished library, Christine made a courageous and virtually unprecedented decision. She would support her family through her writing, becoming one of Europe's first professional female authors. With quill and ink, Christine carved out a place for herself in the almost exclusively male domain of medieval literature. She began by writing love ballads and devotional poetry, genres deemed suitably feminine and unthreatening. But as her confidence and reputation grew, Christine turned her mind to weightier matters. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she crafted an impassioned defense of women against the misogynistic attitudes of her time. With elegant, incisive prose, Christine dismantled the pervasive notion that women were inherently morally and intellectually inferior to men. She argued that women were just as capable of virtue learning and leadership as their male counterparts, if only they were given the chance to prove themselves. Through a series of vivid biographical sketches, Christine celebrated the accomplishments of great female scholars, artists, warriors, and saints throughout history. From the ancient world to her own time, she highlighted women who had overcome overwhelming odds to make their mark on the world. There was the famed scholar Hypatia of Alexandria, brutally murdered by a mob for daring to teach philosophy and mathematics. The fearsome Queen Semiramis of Assyria, a brilliant military tactician who conquered vast swaths of the ancient world. And the saintly mystic Hildegard of Bingen, whose divine visions and soaring musical compositions had earned her renown throughout Christendom. With each story, Christine chipped away at the edifice of misogyny, making a powerful case for the fundamental equality of the sexes. Her radical message resonated with a small but growing audience of educated women, who saw in Christine a beacon of hope in a society that sought to keep them in the shadows. Of course, Christine's proto-feminist views were not well received by the male establishment. She endured harsh criticism and mockery from some quarters. Dismissed as a shrill harpy or a delusional madwoman, her own lifelong struggle for recognition and respect was a testament to the deeply entrenched barriers faced by medieval women, with ambitions beyond hearth and home. But Christine refused to be silenced. She continued to write prolifically until her death around 1430, leaving behind a body of work that would influence generations of women to come. Her legacy is a shining example of how one woman's voice, raised in defiance of oppression, could echo down through the centuries. As we continue our journey through the lives of medieval women, keep Christine de Peasant in mind as a rare flicker of light amidst the darkness. For most of her contemporaries, the possibilities she represented of an independent intellectual life were little more than an impossible dream. Marguerite's story illustrates the precarious position of even noble and high-born women in medieval society. Though an heiress of considerable wealth and status, she was still ultimately at the mercy of the men in her life, to be traded and treated as a possession. The fact that there were few real consequences for her husband's brazen abduction shows how such acts of gendered abuse and oppression were often tolerated or overlooked. A woman's well-being was simply not a priority. Of course, women of lower classes had it even worse, with little money or status to shield them. Peasant women were easy targets for exploitation by lords, masters, and even their own husbands or fathers. Domestic abuse was rampant, seen not as a crime, but as a man's way of controlling his wife and daughters. According to church doctrine, a woman's duty was to obey and submit. If she stepped out of line, violence was considered an acceptable form of discipline. Making matters worse, women had very little recourse or protection under the law. In most parts of medieval Europe, they couldn't press charges against an abuser, request a separation, or seek justice in their own name. Neighborly intervention was rare, as domestic matters were considered private, unless abuse was egregious and notorious enough to become a public scandal. Women were expected to endure in silence. To leave a marriage was to risk complete social ruin. Only in the most extreme cases of cruelty might a noble woman appeal to her own family or the church for help. But such requests were not always heeded. After all, a wife was a husband's property, his to treat as he pleased within the privacy of the home. It was not uncommon for a beaten wife to be sent back to her abuser after a brief respite. Unless her family could afford to quietly retire her to a convent, her options were bleak. The underlying vulnerability of women's position is perhaps best exemplified by one of the most famous abduction cases of the Middle Ages, that of Marguerite of Flanders. Born in 1350, Marguerite was the only daughter of Louis II, Count of Flanders. As his sole heir, she stood to inherit one of the richest territories in Europe, making her a prime catch on the medieval marriage market. At the tender age of 11, she was wed to Philip of Rouvres, Duke of Burgundy, but he died just 4 years later, making teenage Marguerite a very wealthy widow in need of a new husband. Her father swiftly arranged another political match, this time to Philip the Bold, also of Burgundy. However, another suitor was waiting in the wings, Marguerite's own cousin, Louis III, Count of Flanders. Louis was eager to keep control of Flanders within the family. So, in a brazen move, he abducted his young cousin, spiriting her away again. The poor girl had little say in the matter, as the men in her life fought over her considerable fortune, though her father eventually retrieved her and saw through the original betrothal to Philip. The whole sordid affair demonstrates how even elite women were pawns in the power struggles of men. Such casual misogyny and oppression seeped into all aspects of a medieval woman's life, even the spiritual. The teachings of the Catholic Church in this period were heavily imbued with notions of female subservience, sinfulness, and sexual temptation. Ever since Eve took a bite of that forbidden fruit, women were seen as morally weaker and more prone to vice than men. As descendants of Eve, women were considered inherently more lustful, vain, emotionally unsteady, and intellectually deficient. These supposed flaws justified their subordination to cool, rational men who were tasked with controlling women's behavior for their own good and that of society. The church taught that virtuous women were obedient, chaste, modest, quiet, and diligently domestic, always working in service of their fathers, brothers, and husbands. Any deviation from this pious feminine ideal was swiftly condemned. Outspoken, defiant, ambitious, or opinionated women were seen as unnatural and dangerous threats to the social order. And, of course, those who engaged in unsanctioned sexual behavior, sex outside of marriage, adultery, or prostitution were painted as wicked temptresses leading men into sin. Never mind that it was usually men coercing and exploiting women into such compromising situations in the first place. So, it is no surprise that one of the worst labels a woman could attract was that of a witch. The medieval church saw witchcraft as the ultimate expression of feminine evil, a woman enthralled to the devil, using supernatural powers to subvert male authority and corrupt the innocent. What sort of woman would draw such dire accusations? Often, she was a social outcast of some kind, a widow living alone, an unmarried older woman, a midwife or herbalist, a beggar, or someone who didn't quite fit into the prescribed role of demure wife and mother. Such vulnerable women made the perfect scapegoats for any kind of misfortune that might befall a community, from failed crops to sickness to impotence. And the flimsiest of evidence could justify horrific torture and execution methods, from burning at the stake to hanging to drowning. The much-feared witch hunts of the early modern period had their roots in the medieval church's deep distrust and demonization of uncontrolled female power. Of course, the vast majority of women were far from powerful. Quite the opposite. Whether highborn lady or lowly peasant, women led extremely circumscribed lives, their agency limited at every turn by the men who dominated them. And so they turned to prayer. Religion was one of the few spheres that offered women some measure of autonomy and self-expression, albeit in highly controlled forms. Becoming a nun was a rare alternative to marriage, allowing some women to pursue a life of the mind insulated from male demands. Female mystics were also grudgingly tolerated, even revered, so long as they confined their spiritual visions to properly doctrinal subjects. One such mystic was Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress who lived a radical form of monastic life. In her 30s, she requested to be permanently enclosed, or anchored, in a small cell attached to a church where she would spend the rest of her days in solitary prayer and contemplation. The door to her cell was sealed shut in a solemn ceremony, with the expectation that she would never pass through it again, even in death. Her body would later be removed through the high window facing the church interior. For decades, Julian lived in this stone room, no more than 15 paces long, receiving food and necessities through a small opening. And yet, this life of unimaginable isolation and deprivation was still preferable to marriage for some women. At least as an anchoress, Julian was beholden to no man save Christ. She could devote herself fully to her spiritual practice without the burdens of domestic duties or childbearing. Through her high window, she also served as a kind of counselor to parishioners, offering prayers and advice. In this role, she gained a measure of influence and authority rarely granted to women. Her mystical visions, recorded in her book, Revelations of Divine Love, even dared to describe God in feminine terms as a nurturing mother. For a woman to put forth her own theological interpretations was a bold move, to say the least. That her writing survived at all is a testament to the respect she commanded in her community. But Julian's unconventional life was still ultimately one of deprivation and enclosure. Like all medieval women, she lived at the mercy of a patriarchal church and society that saw the female sex as a threat to be contained. Whether trapped in a loveless marriage, confined to a drafty castle, or bricked into a monastic cell, women had precious little control over their own destinies. Their world was one of forced choices and roads not taken, of talents and dreams denied. Submission, silence, and survival were the orders of the day. Medieval women may not have conceptualized their plight in terms of equality or justice, but they surely felt the constraints on their minds and bodies as a kind of slow suffocation, a narrowing of possibilities. And yet they endured. They found what slivers of light they could in the darkness. They took pride in what they could, their children, their handiwork, their faith. They sustained their communities and their families as best they knew how. And in so doing, medieval women laid the foundation for the advancements of subsequent generations. Their sacrifices, their strength, and their quiet resilience paved the way for greater freedoms to come. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us honor these forgotten forebears. Let us dream of the lives they might have lived in a world that cherished them fully. And let us carry their stories forward, recognizing how far we've come and how far we still have to go. For in the end, women's history is human history. Our liberation is forever bound up with one another. And with that, I bid you good night. Rest well, dear listener, and dream of kinder times. Marguerite's harrowing tale illustrates the precarious position of even noble women in medieval society. At the whims of men, their choices and consent mattered little. A woman, especially a wife, was property to be seized and exploited, Unfortunately, such disregard for women's bodily autonomy pervaded all levels of society. Domestic violence was rampant, with husbands entitled to physically chastise their wives as they saw fit. As the 15th century Liber Extra decreed, a man may chastise his wife and beat her for her own correction, for she belongs to him, so may he chastise her. Peasant women often bore the brunt of their husbands' frustrations over grueling field labor, meager food, and wretched living conditions. With large families crammed into tiny cottages, privacy was non-existent and tempers short. The wine and ale consumed to stave off hunger and contaminated water certainly didn't help matters. Higher up the social ladder, aristocratic husbands might exercise a bit more restraint with their beatings to avoid marring their wives' appearances. However, spousal abuse remained common, if more discreet. A noblewoman was still her lord's property to discipline as he pleased behind chamber doors. Her wifely duty was to submit to his authority in all things. Of course, the ultimate violation was marital rape, a concept that didn't even exist in the medieval mindset. As marriage was primarily a vehicle for men to produce legitimate heirs, a husband had an unfettered right to sexual access to his wife's body. Her willing participation was deemed irrelevant. These attitudes were only reinforced by both religious doctrine and the era's rudimentary medical knowledge. Church teachings portrayed women as inherently sinful, lustful creatures who needed to be kept firmly under male control. Female desire was an aberration, whereas male desire was natural and unavoidable. If a husband forced himself on his wife, well, perhaps her wanton behavior had triggered his base urges. Medical texts, meanwhile, claimed that female seed had to be warmed and stimulated to procreation by vigorous action of the male rod. Women's enjoyment was considered essential to conception. By this logic, if a wife became pregnant, surely she must have been a willing participant in the act, regardless of her objections. Between victim blaming and biological misunderstandings, women who suffered sexual violence had little recourse. Speaking out earned scorn, skepticism, and accusations of seduction. She wanted it. She tempted him into sin. The medieval ruling poem even advised, "What you can't prevent, you might as well enjoy." Thus, in the face of assault, a woman's best hope was to avoid pregnancy and additional shame. Midwives and healers passed down secret recipes for herbal abortifacients and contraceptives. Pennyroyal, tansy, and certain fungi could induce miscarriage, while rue and Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot seed worked to prevent conception. Discreet networks of women quietly shared such illicit knowledge. However, even these small rebellions against men's tyranny over their bodies put women at risk of hemorrhage, infection, and worse, accusations of witchcraft. The medieval mindset simply could not conceive of women controlling their own reproductive fates. Anything that enabled them to thwart a husband as prerogative or a God-given pregnancy was surely the devil's work. Perhaps most tragically, some women internalized this oppression, coming to believe they deserved no better than the abuses heaped upon them. When marriage was a woman's only option, and her husband her lord and master, what other choice did she have but to submit? How could she imagine any other way? Yet, despite the trauma inflicted on both flesh and spirit, medieval women endured. They tended to each other's wounds, whispered words of solidarity, and in quiet moments, composed lives that transcended their suffering. Through sheer grit, they carried on being dutiful wives, loving mothers, and keepers of self in a world that granted them precious little. Continuing this time-worn tradition of female resilience was an English mystic, who rose to become one of the most influential Christian theologians of her age. Yet her cloistered existence began not entirely by choice, but as a last resort. For an unmarriageable woman, born in 1343, the woman history knows as Julian of Norwich was likely a surplus daughter in a noble family, fallen on hard times, with no dowry or influential connections. Her options would have been bleak. a burdensome spinster dependent on begrudging relatives, or a life of back-breaking farm labor. For such undesirable women, the convent offered both refuge and a veneer of respectability. Thus, in her early 30s, Julian committed herself to one of the most extreme forms of religious life, that of an anchoress. Literally walled up in a small cell attached to the side of a church, she would spend the rest of her days in prayer and contemplation, never emerging into the light of day. The requisite ceremony carried all the gravity of a funeral mass, and understandably so. An anchoress bade a permanent farewell to the world of the living. The bishop would sprinkle the tomb of her cell with dust and intone, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. With the final breaking of the cell door, she was considered dead to all she previously knew. Entering her tomb, while still very much alive, Julian likely felt a mixture of terror and relief. By the grace of God, she had escaped the trials of marriage and motherhood that consumed and destroyed so many women. Yet, she had condemned herself to a kind of living death, trapped in a stone prison scarcely large enough to lie down in. Still, for the pious Julian, even this harsh existence must have seemed preferable to being some man's chattel. An anchoress enjoyed a degree of autonomy almost unthinkable for a medieval woman. Subsisting on alms left by the faithful, she was beholden to no husband or father. Her days were her own to spend in solitary devotion to her heavenly spouse. Moreover, in a society that regarded most women's words as worthless prattle, an anchoress's pronouncements carried rare spiritual authority. Townsfolk would flock to the small, curtained opening in Julian's cell to pour out their sins and troubles, hoping to receive divine wisdom from the holy woman's lips, and dispense wisdom Julian did, though of a surprisingly progressive bent for her time. In 1373, she experienced a series of vivid visions during a near-fatal illness. These mystical showings radically upended traditional Christian teachings about sin, damnation, and a wrathful God. Critically, her visions centered on Jesus' mother, Mary, and the motherhood of God. Julian saw the divine as a nurturing parent who cherished all creation and could never condemn any beloved child to eternal hellfire. God is our mother as truly as he is our father, she proclaimed. In our mother Jesus, we grow and develop. In mercy, he reforms and restores us. This tender maternal theology stood in stark contrast to the harsh patriarchal view of women as wicked temptresses and soiled vessels of sin. For Julian, it was men's pride and reckless buying of love that marred God's perfect handiwork. Women like Mother Mary embodied the purest form of Christ-like love and mercy. When Julian recorded her subversive insights and revelations of divine love, she became the first woman to write a book in the English language. Despite her physical confines, her radical compassion seeped out to permeate the popular religious imagination. Decades after her walled entombment, local people still referred to her as Dame Julian, who was living at Norwich. Indeed, though Julian's body remained immured in her anchor hold, her mind and soul roamed free. Within her cell, she created an interior world of meaning and beauty that defied the brutality without. For her and many solitary female mystics, the convent was both a refuge and a rare opportunity for intellectual and spiritual self-realization. Still, Julian's unlikely triumph can't negate the tragedy of medieval women's overall plight. That a lifetime of walled solitude was one of their better options speaks to the soul-crushing limitations they faced. The vast majority never escaped the domestic prisons that constrained them from cradle to grave. Yet lying here in the dark, listening to their softly unspooling stories, perhaps we can extend them the same mercy Julian saw in the mother heart of God. We can honor their suffering, resilience, and indomitable will to endure and find meaning despite it all. And in so doing, we strive to create a world where no woman needs to choose between a physical or mental tomb to know her own worth. But again, the Church offered one surprising path forward for some women, pursuing a life devoted to faith. For a select few, joining a convent provided an alternative to marriage and motherhood, a chance to gain influence and exercise their minds. One remarkable woman who took this path was Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098 to a noble family in the Rhineland, as the 10th child, she was tied to the church and sent to live in a monastery at the tender age of 8. Rather than being oppressed by this cloistered life, Hildegard flourished. She experienced mystical visions from a young age, which she documented in vivid theological writings. Her musical compositions were groundbreaking, from stirring hymns to the first known morality play set to music. As an adult, Hildegard went on to found her own abbey and gain widespread fame as a prophet and intellectual across Europe. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings who sought her spiritual insights and advice. Her expertise spanned religion, science, medicine, and philosophy. She used her knowledge of herbal remedies to treat sick nuns and local villagers. While Hildegard's brilliance was exceptional, her story illustrates how monastic life offered an oasis of learning and culture for women. Behind abbey walls, nuns could devote themselves to scholarly pursuits that were off-limits to their married peers. They spent their days in prayer, meditation, tending gardens, and producing incredible works of art and literature. The copying of manuscripts and illumination of sacred text were common tasks. With this freedom to read, write, and create, their minds could wander and grow. Of course, the monastic path was not without sacrifices. Nuns took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, surrendering earthly pleasures and attachments. Their lives were governed by strict routines of prayer and labor, and they were still ultimately under the authority of male religious leaders. But for women with a sincere spiritual calling, the convent was a refuge from the trials of the outside world. Another famous religious woman of the era was Catherine of Siena. Born in 1347 to a large working-class family in Italy from early childhood, Catherine was extremely devout and resisted her parents' attempts to make her an advantageous marriage. She took vows as a Dominican tertiary, or lay member of the order, at age 18 and committed herself to a life of prayer, fasting, and service to the sick and poor. Like Hildegard, Catherine experienced mystical visions of Christ and was regarded as a living saint. She was also unafraid to speak truth to power. Through her passionate letters, she lambasted clergy for corruption and pushed for reform within the church. When the Pope fled Rome for Avignon due to political conflict, Catherine traveled to France and persuaded him to return to the Holy City. As the Great Schism tore Christendom apart with rival papal claimants, Catherine worked tirelessly to restore unity. Her spiritual memoir, The Dialogue, was groundbreaking for its intimate conversations with God at a time when the Church held itself as the necessary intermediary for the divine. Exhausted by her efforts and extreme asceticism, Catherine died at just 33, her body ravaged, but her soul at peace. Women like Hildegard and Catherine demonstrated the potential for intellectual and spiritual greatness even within the constraints of their society. They channeled their faith into lives of purpose that transcended convention. While most medieval women could never dream of wielding such influence, the presence of these monastic scholars and mystics added a layer of complexity to the era's gender dynamics. For the vast majority, however, the church was more of a disciplining force than an elevating one. Parish priests and nuns worked to uphold rigid moral codes, especially around sexuality and propriety. Women's behavior was tightly policed. They were to be obedient, chaste, and above reproach. Stepping outside these bounds could have brutal consequences. In the 13th century, the medieval Inquisition began cracking down on heretical threats to church doctrine. While inquisitors targeted many groups, women were especially vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft and collusion with the devil. What exactly constituted witchcraft was often vague and all-encompassing. Anything from ominous mutterings to mysterious potions could be grounds for suspicion. As fear and superstition swirled, midwives and female healers became prime targets. Their knowledge of childbirth and herbal remedies was interpreted as dark magic. One notorious manual for identifying witches was the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. This lurid text advanced the idea that women were naturally more susceptible to the devil's temptations due to their fickle, carnal natures. It included a script for interrogating accused witches that usually led to confessions under torture. Those found guilty faced horrific deaths, beheading, hanging, or burning at the stake in public spectacles meant to terrify others into piety and conformity. While the full-fledged witch hunts peaked in the 16th to 17th centuries, their roots lay in the medieval church's deep mistrust of women's power. Of course, the specter of witchcraft could also be used for more cynical ends. Charges might be levied to punish a woman who spurned a man's advances, or dared to speak her mind too boldly. Widowed or single women living on the margins of society were common scapegoats. The vague nature of the crime made it a convenient pretense for removing inconvenient women. Beyond the most violent episodes, daily spiritual life centered on a steady stream of masses, feast days, and seasonal celebrations. Women were expected to be the pious heart of the family, tending to prayers and devotions. The cycle of church festivals structured the year: Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Saints' Days. Much of a woman's free time revolved around preparing for these events. At the same time, traces of older pagan traditions endured and mingled with Christian practices. Medieval holidays often had raucous, earthy elements like maypole dances and harvest revelry that the church tried to tame. Some women surely found ways to experience joy and release within these quasi-religious festivities. Ultimately, the church was a ubiquitous framework that medieval women had to navigate with extreme caution. It offered both an ideological justification for their subjugation and an occasional escape route from worldly demands. Women had to walk a razor's edge, meeting high expectations of virtue while facing perpetual suspicion. Conformity to religious doctrine was yet another constraint on their freedom. As we've seen, whether in the domestic sphere, the world of work, or the eyes of the church, medieval women faced relentless challenges. But even in this unforgiving landscape, some found ways to carve out meaning and exert agency, however small. In the final stretch of our journey through this distant yet resonant era, we'll meet a few more extraordinary women who managed to make their mark, and consider how the medieval mindset continues to shape gender dynamics today. The road behind us is long and winding, but there are still revelations ahead. The days were long and arduous for medieval women, filled with a never-ending litany of chores and responsibilities. From sunup until sundown, a woman's work was truly never done. While their husbands and fathers toiled in the fields plying their trades or rode off to war, it fell to the women to keep the home fires burning, and burning they kept them rising before dawn. Each day to stoke the flames, cook the meals, tend to children, and care for the sick and elderly. There was little rest and even less recognition for the vital role women played in keeping their families and communities functioning. Their daily labors were seen as simply an extension of their womanly duties, as natural and expected as the rising and setting of the sun. A woman's worth was measured not by her intelligence, her talents, or her dreams, but by the son she bore, the tidiness of her home, and the subservience she showed to her male betters. The few women who dared to step outside of these confining roles faced scorn, suspicion, and even outright danger. To be an independent woman, or God forbid an educated one, was to go against the very laws of nature in the eyes of medieval society. The weaker sex had their place, and woe betide any woman who strayed from it. But even within the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of a woman's existence, there were those who found ways to carve out a measure of agency and self-determination. Through sheer force of will, they made a way out of no way. They bent the rules that would constrain them, exploited the loopholes in the patriarchy, and when all else failed, they secretly subverted and undermined the system that sought to keep them down. These were the women who became healers and midwives, nuns and anchoresses, artists and writers. They were the ones who brewed ale and traded in the marketplaces, who spun and wove and built cottage industries that supported their families. They may not have overtly defied the status quo, but in their own quiet ways, they challenged it every single day. One such woman was Christine de Peasant, often regarded as Europe's first professional female writer. Born in Venice in 1364, Christine's intellectual gifts were recognized and nurtured from a young age by her forward-thinking father. Educated alongside her brothers, Christine dove headlong into the study of languages, classic literature, and the sciences pursuits that were essentially off-limits to girls and women at the time. When she was just 15, Christine's father arranged for her to marry a royal secretary at the French court. It was an auspicious match, and one that brought Christine into an exciting new world of politics, art, and scholarly discourse. For a time, the young bride reveled in the rarefied air of the royal court, attending salons and penning love ballads that earned her the admiration of her learned peers. But Christine's charmed life would soon be disrupted by a series of heartbreaking losses. First, her father, and then her beloved husband both died unexpectedly, leaving Christine a widow and single mother at the age of just 25. With no male protection or support, Christine and her children faced an uncertain future. Lesser women might have crumbled under the weight of such adversity, but not Christine de Peasant. With characteristic pluck and determination, she picked up her pen and parchment and went to work. At a time when few women could even read and write, Christine began producing poems, essays, and allegorical works at a prodigious rate. Her output was astounding, both for its sheer volume and its daring originality. What made Christine a truly revolutionary figure, however, was not just her literary prowess, but also her willingness to tackle subjects that were considered strictly off-limits for women. She wrote extensively about politics, war, and the role of women in society, boldly challenging the misogynistic attitudes of the day. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, was a spirited defense of women's intellect and capabilities, and a scathing critique of the many injustices they faced. In this groundbreaking text, Christine reimagined history from a female perspective, celebrating the accomplishments of great women throughout the ages. She conjured a utopian city populated and governed entirely by women, where they were free to pursue knowledge, art, and self-fulfillment without limits. It was a radical vision for its time, and one that would plant the seeds of feminist thought for generations to come. Through her words, Christine de Peasant not only made a name and a living for herself, but she also opened up new possibilities for women in the world of letters. She showed that a woman could be both a serious scholar and a commercially successful author, paving the way for other gifted female writers to follow in her footsteps. Of course, Christine's remarkable success story was very much the exception rather than the rule in medieval times. For the vast majority of women, the pursuit of education and intellectual endeavors remained an impossible dream. Most could not read or write, and even those who could were often discouraged or outright forbidden from doing so by the men in their lives. The idea that women were mentally inferior to men was so ingrained in medieval society that it was practically accepted as gospel truth. Learned scholars and religious leaders devoted endless pages to elaborate theories about the deficiencies of the female mind. Women, they argued, were too weak, too emotional, and too easily swayed by temptation to be trusted with serious matters of the intellect. These beliefs had very real and damaging consequences for medieval women's health and well-being. With little understanding of female biology, physicians routinely misdiagnosed and mistreated women's medical issues. Menstruation was seen as a curse, a sign of women's inherent uncleanliness. Menopause was considered a form of madness, and childbirth, that most quintessentially female experience, was a perilous undertaking that claimed countless lives. In the absence of trained doctors and midwives, women were left to rely on folk remedies, superstition, and the wisdom of other women to see them through their most vulnerable moments. Herbal concoctions were brewed to ease the pain of labor. Amulets and charms clutched in the hopes of ensuring a safe delivery. But all too often, these desperate measures were not enough, even for those women who did survive the dangers of childbirth. The specter of death was never far off. Disease and malnutrition were rampant, and accidents a constant threat in a world lit only by fire. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. A fall from a horse or down a flight of stairs could leave a woman crippled or worse. And if a woman did beat the odds and make it to old age, she was likely to be widowed, impoverished, and utterly reliant on the charity of others. In a society with no social safety nets, the fate of an aging woman was often a grim one indeed. With no husband or male children to provide for her, she might be forced to beg for scraps or move in with resentful relatives, who saw her as nothing more than a burden. If she was lucky, she might find work as a servant or caregiver, eking out a meager living in her final years. But all too often, she would simply be left to fend for herself, abandoned and forgotten by a world that no longer had any use for her. It's a bleak picture, to be sure, but it's important that we don't forget the harsh realities faced by our foremothers. Their struggles, their sacrifices, and their quiet acts of resilience paved the way for the freedoms and opportunities we enjoy today. We stand on the shoulders of giants, even if their names have been lost to history. But as much as we might like to imagine that we be left the injustices of the past behind us, the truth is that women's rights remain a work in progress. Even now in the 21st century, women around the world continue to face discrimination, violence, and oppression on a daily basis. The specifics may have changed, but the underlying attitudes and power structures that enable such abuses are not so different from those of medieval times. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And as we continue the fight for true equality, we would do well to remember the women who came before us, the Christines and the Eleanors, the nameless mothers and daughters, who endured unimaginable hardships and yet found ways to persevere. Their strength, their courage, and their indomitable spirit live on in each and every one of us. It falls to us to honor their legacy and to keep pushing forward until the day when every woman everywhere can live freely, fully, and without fear. So, let us not look back on the lives of medieval women with pity or condescension, but rather with deep respect and admiration. Theirs was a world we can scarcely imagine, a world of unrelenting toil and unimaginable grief. And yet, in the face of it all, they found ways to carve out moments of joy, resilience, and even rebellion. They were the unsung heroes of their age, the ones who held up half the sky, even as the weight of the world pressed down upon their shoulders. We owe them a debt that can never be fully repaid. But we can start by remembering their stories, by speaking their names, and by carrying on their fight. For as long as there is injustice in this world, as long as there are women who are denied their basic rights and dignity, their work will not be done, and neither will ours. So let us draw strength from their example, and let us never forget the sacrifices they made so that we might one day live in a world where every woman can rise up and claim her place in the sun. It's a dream worth fighting for, and one that we must never stop pursuing for the sake of our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, and all the generations of women yet to come. As we've seen, life for women in the Middle Ages was full of hardships and challenges that are difficult for us to fully comprehend today. From the moment they were born, girls faced an uphill battle and a world stacked against them. Childhood was a precarious time, with many not surviving past the age of 5 due to disease, malnourishment, and lack of medical knowledge. Those who did make it often had to grow up far too fast. For noble girls like Isabeau of Bavaria, the transition from childhood to adulthood could be especially abrupt. At the tender age of 15, Isabeau was sent from her home in Bavaria to France to wed King Charles VI, a man she had never met who was more than a decade her senior. Imagine the fear and trepidation she must have felt as she left behind everything familiar, to embark on a journey to a foreign land and an uncertain future. Isabeau's marriage to Charles was arranged for political reasons, as was typical of the time. Love and personal compatibility were rarely factors in these contracts between powerful families. Instead, a woman's value was tied to her fertility and ability to produce male heirs to carry on the dynastic line. This placed enormous pressure on young brides like Isabeau. Complicating matters further, Isabeau's new husband Charles was not of sound mind. Prone to bouts of madness that could last for months at a time, he was in no state to rule his kingdom, let alone be a supportive partner. As a result, much of the burden fell on Isabeau's shoulders. Still practically a child herself, she was thrust into the demanding role of queen, expected to manage the royal household, host dignitaries, patronize the arts and charities, all while being pregnant or recovering from childbirth virtually every year. Remarkably, despite the instability of her husband and the scheming of power-hungry nobles around her, Isabeau managed to hold the French monarchy together through sheer force of will. She bore Charles several children, including the future Charles VII. When her husband was incapacitated by his fits of madness, she served as regent in his place, wielding authority normally reserved only for men. And as the 100 Years' War raged between England and France, she became an adept diplomat, negotiating treaties and even personally leading armies into battle while heavily pregnant. Isabeau's story is a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of medieval women in the face of incredible adversity, but it also highlights how even the most privileged and powerful of women were still severely constrained by the patriarchal attitudes and institutions of the time. For the vast majority of women who were not born into nobility, daily life was a constant struggle of back-breaking labor and drudgery. Whereas wealthy women like Isabeau had servants to handle cooking, cleaning, and childcare, peasant women had to shoulder all of the domestic burdens themselves. On top of helping their husbands with farming and other laborious tasks, the lives of medieval peasant women revolved around an endless cycle of repetitive, physically demanding chores from sunup to sundown. There was water to be fetched from the well, firewood to be gathered, animals to be fed, bread to be baked, and meals to be cooked in heavy iron pots over hot, smoky fires. Clothes had to be washed by hand in the river or local stream, then hung to dry. Candles and soap had to be made from rendered animal fat. And of course, there was the constant spinning of wool into yarn, so ubiquitous a task for women that spinster became a term for an unmarried woman. With all of these essential duties to perform, peasant women had precious little leisure time. Noble women, by contrast, were freed from most of this menial labor, but they too lacked control over their own time and activities. When not tending to their required religious devotions, noble women were expected to spend their days on respectable feminine pastimes like needlework, music, and overseeing the servants, with little opportunity to pursue their own interests and ambitions outside of the domestic sphere, regardless of class. The one thing virtually all medieval women had in common was their subservient position to men. Daughters were under the authority of their fathers, wives under that of their husbands. Women had few legal rights and protections of their own. Instead, they were seen as property to be transferred from one man to another, their value tied to their dowry, their chastity, and their ability to bear children. Even within the home, a woman had little autonomy. Husbands had the right to make all decisions for the household and to control their wives' behavior and movements as they saw fit, by force if necessary. Domestic violence was rampant, as men were taught it was their husbandly duty to chastise and discipline their wives physically, or otherwise if they stepped out of line. Marital rape was not a concept. A woman's body belonged to her husband to use as he pleased. If a woman dared to defy her husband or was perceived to have damaged his reputation or honor, the consequences could be severe. When Margarita Flanders was abducted on her wedding day by her furious husband, Louis of Maille, who accused her of infidelity, she was imprisoned in her own castle for 2 years. Louis eventually released her after the Pope threatened him with excommunication. But the scandal followed Marguerite for the rest of her life. Such was the dilemma of medieval women. Damned if they did and damned if they didn't. On the one hand, they were expected to be perfect paragons of virtue, chastity, and obedience. Their every move was scrutinized for the slightest hint of impropriety that could tarnish their reputation and that of their family. At the same time, women were seen as inherently sinful and morally weak creatures, forever tainted by the legacy of Eve, the original temptress. This contradiction placed women in an impossible bind, and the church and society at large were all too eager to police their behavior. Modesty and purity were demanded at all times. Women were to be silent and hidden, lest they lead men into temptation with their dangerous feminine wiles. Daring to express sexuality or engage in any unapproved contact with men, even something as innocuous as dancing or flirting, could brand a woman as a harlot. Punishments for accused unchaste behavior included public whipping, dunking in water, exile from the community, and even in extreme cases, death. As we can see, life for the medieval woman was, in many ways, a lose-lose situation. Isolated, disempowered, and trapped in rigid roles and expectations, women had to tread a razor-thin line in a world where the deck was stacked against them. But even in the face of such oppression and hardship, medieval women found ways to carve out meaningful lives and to shape their world in ways big and small. Take Christine de Peasant, for example. Born in Venice in 1364, Christine had the good fortune to be the daughter of a scholar who encouraged her intellectual curiosity from a young age. Well-educated and fluent in several languages, Christine was a rarity among medieval women. When her husband died, leaving her a widow at 25, Christine did something even more extraordinary for the time. She became Europe's first professional female author, writing poems, books, and treatises that challenged the misogynistic attitudes of the day and argued for the equality of the sexes. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, Christine creates an allegorical city inhabited by women of virtue and achievement throughout history. By celebrating the accomplishments and worth of women at a time when they were more often denigrated, Christine planted the seeds of what we might now call feminism. Her revolutionary ideas would go on to influence thinkers for generations to come. Christine was not the only medieval woman to break the mold. Hildegard of Bingen was a 12th century German abbess who made pioneering contributions to fields as diverse as theology, medicine, botany, and music composition. Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant girl who led the French army to improbable victories in the 100 Years' War, became a legendary heroine and an enduring symbol of female power. These exceptional women hint at the untapped potential and strength of so many of their contemporaries whose names and deeds have been lost to history. It is easy to get lost in the litany of the obstructions and abuses medieval women faced, and to overlook their indomitable spirit in the face of adversity. Yes, their hardships and circumstances were in many ways appalling from our modern vantage point, but we shouldn't lose sight of their humanity, tenacity, and courage as well. Life for the average medieval woman was defined by grueling work, suffocating limitations, and the ever-present threat of violence. And yet they persisted and endured. Through ingenuity and grit, through finding meaning and connection where they could, through the bonds of family and female friendship, these women survived and even thrived as best they could against the odds. Theirs is a legacy that is often neglected and undervalued, relegated literally to the margins of history books in favor of the deeds of great men. But taking the time to learn about and reflect on the daily struggles and triumphs of medieval women enriches our understanding of the human experience. It puts our own modern-day lives and lingering gender imbalances in perspective, and it reminds us of the strength and resilience of the so-called fairer sex. who have always been the backbone and lifeblood of human society, regardless of the recognition and freedoms granted or denied them. The plight of medieval women can perhaps be best summed up by Christine de Peasant, when she lamented in the Book of the City of Ladies, "No matter which way I turn, no matter where I cast my eyes, I see nothing but the cruelty of men towards women. And yet, God knows, women are not of a different species from men. They are human beings just as much as men are. Though separated from us by centuries, Christine's words still ring painfully true. Medieval European women may have endured especially trying circumstances, but the basic inequalities and attitudes that constrain them have echoed across continents and eras. The fight for true female empowerment and equality is, in many ways, the defining struggle of human history, one that continues to this day. But as we reflect back on and honor the lives of medieval women, lives of endless labor, of stifling limitations, and also of indomitable fortitude, we can draw strength and inspiration from their example. They remind us of how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. As we've seen, women in medieval times faced immense challenges and oppression in nearly every aspect of their lives. From the moment they were born, girls were at a disadvantage, seen as a burden on their families. Many did not survive infancy due to poor medical care, malnutrition, and unsanitary living conditions. Those who did live past childhood had difficult roads ahead of them. Education for girls was minimal, focused mainly on basic literacy, religious doctrine, and skills to make them good wives and mothers, like needlework, cooking, and household management. Unlike their brothers, girls weren't taught more academic subjects or allowed to pursue professions. Their path in life was limited and predetermined. Even more restrictive were the early marriages that most girls were subjected to, usually in their early to mid-teens. These arranged unions were made to cement political alliances or business deals between powerful families with little regard for the desires of the young bride. She was essentially being traded as property from her father to her new husband. One poignant example is the story of Isabeau of Bavaria. At the tender age of 15, she was sent from her home in Bavaria to marry King Charles VI of France, a man she had never met who was many years her senior. Leaving behind everything familiar, she had to adapt to a foreign court and an unstable husband prone to fits of madness. As queen, Isabeau was thrust into a role of great responsibility, expected to exert a calming influence on her volatile spouse, and produce male heirs to secure the royal line. All of this as a lonely teenage girl in a strange land. Her youth and lack of power in her marriage left her vulnerable to schemes and manipulation by other nobles. While Isabeau's tale is singular in its royal setting, in many ways it represents the lack of agency most medieval women experienced when it came to their marriages. A girl's father or brothers generally arranged her marriage, using it to improve the family's social standing and forge advantageous connections. Her consent was not required or even considered important. Once married, a woman came under her husband's authority and was expected to obey him as lord and master. Her key duties were to manage the household, which was no easy task, and bear as many children as possible, especially sons. Failure to produce a male heir was seen as a wife's fault, not her husband's, and could result in her being scorned or even cast aside. Childbirth itself was incredibly perilous in an age before modern medicine. Maternal mortality rates were extremely high, with many women dying in childbirth from complications like hemorrhage or infection. Babies faced grim odds, as disease, accidents, and poor nutrition claimed many before their first birthdays. Even queens were not immune to these dangers. Over the course of her marriage, Eleanor of Castile, wife of King Edward I of England, endured a staggering 16 pregnancies. While she did manage to provide for several surviving sons, including the future King Edward II, Eleanor suffered many losses as well. Records indicate at least 3 of her babies were either stillborn or died shortly after birth. Others survived infancy only to be cut down by the illnesses that ran rampant in medieval times. Eleanor's own health was damaged by so many pregnancies and deliveries. She developed a prolapsed uterus, a painful condition that plagued her later years. In an era of limited contraception and no anesthesia or antibiotics, pregnancy was practically unavoidable for most married women and posed a serious threat to their well-being every time. But it was their duty to their husbands and society to keep bearing children despite the risks. This was just one of many ways a woman's needs and comfort were considered secondary to a husband's desires and the family's reputation. Her very life could be expendable in the quest for heirs. Such was the reality in a world where women were judged chiefly on their fertility and had few rights over their own bodies. Beyond the tribulations of multiple dangerous pregnancies, day-to-day domestic life for the typical medieval housewife was full of hardship and drudgery. She was essentially on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, responsible for cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, sewing and mending clothes, tending kitchen gardens and livestock, preserving food, and more. Hers was an existence of never-ending toil with infrequent breaks for rest or leisure. Up before dawn to stoke the fires and begin morning chores. She rarely stopped working until the rest of her family went to bed. Forget any notions of me time. A woman's schedule revolved completely around serving her husband and children. Depending on her family's social class, a housewife might have a maidservant or two to assist her, but their presence often meant additional work and training and supervising them. Lower-class women, of course, lacked this luxury and had to shoulder their heavy burdens alone. In cramped quarters with poor ventilation, she sweated over open hearth fires and cauldrons, hauling heavy pots of water and breathing in smoke. Laundering clothes and linens was an arduous, time-consuming process involving vats of boiling water, lye soap, and a washing board to scrub out stains. No convenient appliances like washing machines or vacuums, just pure elbow grease. Given the lack of indoor plumbing, disposing of chamber pots and cleaning privies was another lovely task, as was hauling water from the nearest well or stream for cooking, bathing, and household use. Forget running taps. She lugged heavy buckets back and forth multiple times a day. Preparing meals was a constant cycle, without modern methods of food preservation and storage. No popping something in the microwave or opening a can. Cooking from scratch took hours and required planning ahead to make sure ingredients were on hand. Slaughtering and butchering animals, plucking fowl, smoking meats, curing fish, more delightful jobs that fell to the woman of the house. Then there was the making and mending of garments. In an age before ready-to-wear or store-bought clothing, a housewife had to create wardrobes for her entire family, right down to the brace. Spinning yarn, weaving fabric, cutting, and sewing a single piece could take weeks to complete. When clothes inevitably wore out, she'd patch and darn them to get a bit more use before starting again. Toss in childcare, kitchen gardening, tending the sick with herbal remedies, perhaps making cheese, candles, or ale for extra income, and you begin to get the picture. Managing a medieval household was a massive undertaking requiring stamina, skill, and self-sacrifice. It left little room for anything else. Even women of noble rank, with more servants at their disposal, were still expected to oversee these affairs and pitch in with needlework and such. They might escape some of the roughest chores, but their lives were still enormously circumscribed compared to their husbands. While he got to ride off on business, politics, or warfare, she was mostly stuck at home minding the domestic front. So, from wealthiest to poorest, women in the Middle Ages faced unrelenting labor with precious little rest, assistance, or appreciation, rising earlier and working later than their spouses in most cases, yet always deferring to male authority. A woman's work was truly never done. Not that she got much credit for keeping everyone else clothed, fed, and functioning. while the anchoresses like Julian of Norwich found their calling in seclusion and contemplation. Other religious women took a more active role in medieval society. The growth of the mendicant orders in the 13th century, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans, opened up new opportunities for women to serve God and their communities. These orders welcomed lay sisters known as tertiaries, who took vows of chastity and service but lived and worked in the secular world, rather than cloistered away in convents. Tertiaries ran hospitals, taught children, and cared for the poor and sick. They had more freedom of movement and association than enclosed nuns. One notable tertiary was St. Catherine of Siena, born in 1347 to a large Italian family. From a young age, Catherine was drawn to an intense spiritual life of fasting and self-denial. Against her parents' wishes, she joined the Dominican tertiary in her late teens. Unusually for a woman of her time, Catherine learned to read and write. She began corresponding with church leaders, offering advice and admonishment. She even rebuked the Pope for living in France rather than Rome. Imagine the audacity it took for a young laywoman to criticize the Vicar of Christ himself. Yet, miraculously, the Pope listened. Swayed by Catherine's piety and wisdom, Pope Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, ending the Avignon papacy. Saint Catherine was not only bold in confronting the powerful, but also tender in comforting the lowly. During the plague outbreak in Siena, she nursed the sick and dying, dressing their oozing sores without any thought for her own safety. She saw Christ in the face of every suffering soul. Though Catherine and her fellow tertiaries did much good, they still lived and worked within a strict patriarchal system that limited women's voices. Only the most exceptional could rise to positions of influence, and always under the authority of male superiors. Most medieval women, of course, were not destined for sainthood or political influence. They simply toiled day after day, bearing as best they could the many hardships and restrictions placed on their sex. It is difficult for us in the modern day to fully grasp the lack of agency. Women had over their own lives and bodies, from birth until death. A woman belonged to the men in her life. First her father, then her husband, perhaps her son in widowhood. She had little say in whom she would marry, how many children she would bear, or what labor she would do. Education, property rights, and legal recourse against abuse were all heavily circumscribed. And yet, to paint medieval women as merely passive victims of oppression does not do justice to their full humanity. Within their narrow spheres, they found ways to carve meaning and wield what power they could. They formed supportive networks with female friends and relatives. They took pride in their children, their handiwork, their piety, in everyday acts of resilience. A village woman going out to gather herbs to heal her sick child, an abused wife seeking sanctuary in a convent, a nobleman's daughter sweet-talking her father into a slightly later marriage. We see the unsung strength of the medieval woman. She may have had little control over the wider tides of history, politics, and religion that shaped her world, but in her daily life, she did what she needed to do to survive, and if she was very lucky, to find moments of joy and purpose. One small pleasure that was acceptable for women was, in fact, storytelling. In the castles, women might regale each other with romantic tales of brave knights and their lady loves as they worked at their embroidery. In the villages, as the women spun and wove, they would share old legends and fairy tales passed down from their mothers and grandmothers. Telling stories was a way to entertain, to teach lessons, to dream of a world that was a little bit brighter and more hopeful than the drudgery of their daily routine. So, although they left behind few written records in their own voices, the medieval women still shaped our culture through the stories they curated and kept alive, even in the darkest of times. In a way, the act of you and I engaging with history like this continues that lineage, spinning tales of people long gone, wondering about their struggles and their small victories stitching together a more vivid understanding of our shared human experience. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of medieval women, I invite you to sit with that understanding for a moment. Imagine all the women, the queens and the peasants, the nuns and the brewers, the teenagers wed to grandfathers and the weary old widows. Imagine them all as fully real people with fears and foibles and moments of surprising gumption, not so different from you or I. And as you drift off to sleep, I hope you'll dream of them. Dream of the ways, big and small, they shaped their world and paved the way for the freedoms we enjoy today. Honor their memory, even as we work to build a world where all people, regardless of gender, have the opportunity to live freely and chart their own destinies. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the forgotten corners of history. If you found it meaningful or relaxing, I hope you liked this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the fascinating, frustrating, quietly inspiring tales of our shared past. There are so many stories left to tell, and I look forward to dreaming them with you. Sweet dreams.